Okay. So, before we get into some of the new stuff for today and picking up on discussion leading, I wanted to thank you for taking the time to complete the early feedback form. If you haven't had the chance to do that, then you're still welcome to do so and turn in sort of your feedback. Again, I like to do that because it helps me know what's going well in the class and some of the things that I can do to adjust and make your experience work better. So I brought up last class that there was a couple folks that mentioned having a timeline for completing the essay was really helpful. So I talked a little bit about that last Friday. You can use the slides to try to visualize and imagine what that timeline might look like for you and how you can apply that. I also, again, wanted to highlight some of the key terms for today. So some things that seemed like are going well for people, how we review some key ideas in the class. So using things like practice questions to review things from the previous class, examples and applications. So, doing activities and things that let us use these concepts in the world. And then breaking up the class, so it's not just me talking at you, but that we have things like group activities, individual prompts, and so on, seem to be working well. Some adjustments, right? Highlighting key terms. Again, I'll do that again on Wednesday in order to help you prepare on some of the new content. Having more time for things like participation, discussions, and so on is something that I plan on using in the future, right? So we have more kind of conversations as a group. And then if you feel like the expectations for the course or ways of receiving support for the course are unclear, I'm happy to help you further with that. Again, I try to do kind of rubrics, outlines, and examples to help you know what to expect on some of the major assignments. And then I also have, those office hours, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 10 to noon. I can also set up an appointment for you. But if there's any point where you feel like you need additional support in the course, or expectations on certain assignments and things are not clear, I'm happy to talk with you about that and further support you in the class. So thanks for completing that. Again, I like to apply and use some of these points. So I'll address some more of the points that you all have raised in that feedback form as we continue. So I went over these new terms. Again, these are the ones that we'll be going over for today. So let's get into that. So I think the group did a great job of going over the key new concepts and ideas for class. So things such as the Johari window, the different quadrants of conversation styles, and so on, are things we're going to hit on and talk about a little bit more. There's also some elements of conversation and communication that we'll get into in a little bit more detail too. So one new idea for today is the idea of social penetration theory, right? So we'll use that example in order to better understand the decisions that we might make on self-disclosure. So one of the key ideas here is this idea of a conversation. So, one thing that people have expressed concern about in recent years is that we don't have nearly as much conversation as we used to, right? That maybe the core skills and ideas of conversation or being a conversationalist have fell by the wayside, but other people would argue that the way that we use conversation has just kind of changed. It's changed a lot because of technology, right? Phones, using social media, and so on. And so there's a unique set of challenges that we have to engage in conversation. Of course, COVID-19 has also played a really big role. But when we think about what conversation is, right, how we can define it, generally speaking, right, while you have interpersonal communication, conversation generally involves two or more people. So while you can talk to yourself, it generally means there's somebody else there that's not you that's able to participate and contribute to the conversation, right? So the idea that it's two or more people is a really big idea. It can be face-to-face, but it doesn't necessarily have to be, especially through doing something like a phone call or a Zoom call or something like that, right? You still have the ability to engage in conversation with somebody else. One of the key ideas here of a conversation, what makes a conversation unique, is the idea that it's reciprocal, that it's in many ways a dance or an ability for you and the other person to mutually learn from or engage with each other. One of the first ideas that was brought up in the class was this concept of uncertainty reduction theory. And one of the core ideas here is that when you're just getting to know somebody, and you have a lot of uncertainty about the relationship and about who that person is, generally speaking, your conversations are going to be really reciprocal. In other words, you are going to share the exact amount that the other person is going to share. So there tends to be a lot of kind of unnatural conversations that you and them will have. How are you doing? Okay, how are you? Okay, how are you? It's very kind of surface level, right? It doesn't get very far. Whereas, as a conversation develops, it actually becomes a lot of times less reciprocal. And you can think about this, if you have a really good friend, and maybe there's one day where they just had a big breakup, or a big test is coming up, and they really lean on you for support and vent with you. And then another week where maybe you have a lot to say and contribute to the conversation. So what ends up happening is as you get to know and feel more comfortable with somebody and trust them, you're more comfortable recognizing that not every conversation is going to be totally equal. It could be more one-sided, and so on. Another really big thing that helps to make a conversation at least somewhat reciprocal is the idea of feedback. If you think earlier about the transactional model of communication, right? The communication is this kind of exchange between two people. And typically, right, you have somebody who's sending the message, somebody who's receiving the message, and you also have feedback. And so even if a conversation feels fairly one-sided, it's like a parent talking to you or something like a lecture, right? Even then, there's the element of feedback from the other person. Feedback can be nonverbal, it can be things like nodding, following along, saying yes, doing things like that impact the process. So maybe you're venting to somebody about how you're having a long day, and they seem really distressed and kind of tired. You're probably going to change how you talk about it and notice that and check in with them. And that feedback is going to impact how you understand and engage in the conversation yourself, right? So feedback is definitely a thing that helps make a conversation reciprocal and less one-sided. So also, right, a big reason why we choose to be in conversation is in order to disclose about ourselves. We use conversation to share who we are and to share a version of ourselves that we want other people to get to know, right? We talk to others because we believe we want to know them, and we want to some degree, have them know us, right? So self-disclosure plays a really big role here. We communicate, right, to fulfill a lot of different types of needs. And this goes all the way back to the beginning of the quarter, when we were talking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right? At the very bottom, facing the pyramid, you have the crucial things that you need to survive. At the very top, you have self-actualization, being the best version of yourself you can be. And somewhere in the middle, you have a lot of kind of social needs like friendships, romantic relationships, and so on, right? So typically, your communication needs are physical. I need a glass of water, right? Or maybe you're talking in a really practical or logistical way with somebody. I need your notes on the desk. You're thinking identity-based, right? So you're using conversation and communication to establish your identity and to figure out who you are as a unique person, right? So oftentimes people develop and start to disclose things about themselves and their interests, whether it's disclosing things like sexuality or gender identity, right? Or it's about disclosing the activities or things that you like to do. Then that's something that you develop over time through your disclosure and conversations with others. And again, your social needs as well are really important. The friendships that you form, the connections that you feel are important to you, are deeply tied to what you choose to share with other people. So we communicate, right, and use conversation to fulfill a lot of these unique types of needs. And we also have a lot of different motives and goals that tie together to these. So we can think about communication motives as the sort of why we do communication, right? So those are the overarching things that we hope to gain from our communication with somebody else. One of them being control, right? So we might want to establish some level of power over the situation. So we communicate to control, hey, I need a glass of water, and you control that situation by getting the water and getting what you need to survive. We communicate sometimes for relaxation, right, in order to feel like we're able to unwind or escape from a situation that might be stressful, especially if we're dealing with something like a fight or flight response, accumulated fatigue, and so on. So we're about a month in, I know, right, that can develop. Escape, so we communicate to get out of and physically leave, especially if the situation is tense. We communicate for inclusion, right? We're oftentimes motivated to allow others to participate or to feel like we belong as a member of a group. You can think back to our discussion on culture last week. One of the key ideas here is this notion of cultural esteem, the way that we value ourselves as a member of a culture or group. Do we feel included? Do we feel like we value this group that we're a part of? You know, do we have good esteem toward that culture? Affection, right? We can communicate to convey positive feelings about another person or group. Hey, you know, I really love and enjoy spending time with you. That can be one way that you use communication to fulfill that need. And pleasure, right? Whether it's for kind of fulfilling basic human needs that help us to feel good, are ways that we can communicate with these motives in mind. Again, I know this is fairly straightforward, but it's a good way for us to think about why we might choose to disclose and share different elements of ourselves. So the kind of social cultural theorist Carl Jung brings together this idea of a persona or an identity that's a sort of mask that we wear, right? So oftentimes when we communicate with other people, we're communicating a version of ourselves that doesn't necessarily reflect entirely who we are, but we could have people we're really close with and we feel like we're 100% of ourselves around them. So, right, self-disclosure in many ways deals with the figurative throwing away or lifting the mask that you have. Obviously not literally yet, unfortunately, but it deals with the idea that you can peel away or share who you truly are with other people. Oftentimes, right, we have this idea that there is like a true self or a true version of us that we might have to hold back within layers with masking or performance that we do every day. This is especially true for folks that might have a kind of hidden or closeted identity, right? So if somebody identifies within the LGBTQ plus community, but is not out to friends or family or certain people in their lives, right, that can deal with self-disclosure, the degree of comfort that we feel around how somebody might respond to that information. So we'll oftentimes use self-disclosure in a way that relates toward trust and comfort around other people. So generally speaking, right, self-disclosure is a pretty big deal. It matters a lot to us as people. And so we'll do it for social integration as well as impression management. Social integration being the idea that we use our communication and self-disclosure in order to become a member of a society or group. So for instance, if you're interested in joining something like the philosophy club, right, maybe you'll use self-disclosure and say, hey, I love philosophy. As a kid, I was super into like reading Aristotle and Kant, and even though it was way past my reading level, I still did it anyway and stayed up late at night. You might use that and disclose those elements about your interests to feel like you're a member of the group, to integrate and explain why you fit in. So that's one reason we might self-disclose. We also use it to manage our impressions about other people, right? So one idea that's brought about is the significance of a first impression. Because whether it's positive or negative, right, oftentimes the first time you see somebody, it's going to drastically shape the way that you interact with that person every other time. So especially if you're doing something like a job interview or you're meeting somebody significant in your life for the first time, you really try hard to make a good impression, right? And that idea of impression management is especially important for us when we're thinking about the relationships that we make with other people, and how we want to be perceived within those relationships. One idea that a lot of people brought up, right, is that on social media, you might be presenting a version of yourself that, you know, might be pretty accurate or pretty similar to how you were face-to-face, but there's going to be some differences. Maybe they're intentional, or maybe they come across unintentionally. I really liked a discussion that was brought up in class about how while you might choose to be 100% yourself on social media, right, you're not necessarily posting 24/7. So when you're on social media and posting, maybe it's like you're posting the really cool places you've traveled to or been to, and you seem a lot more interesting, even though each of those posts are like a couple months apart. So to some degree, how we behave and how we act on social media is to some degree skewed and doesn't give somebody the whole picture of who we are. In other words, there's nobody who sees us 24/7. Unless you have a camera attached to you and somebody's watching you all the time, which would be kind of weird, right? Nobody is seeing you all the time. So there's always some way that you're modifying or showing a part of yourself in the interactions that you have, even if it's somebody that you see quite a bit of the time, right? So self-descriptions are one way that we manage our impressions. So if you've ever had to submit like a little bio or blurb or thing about yourself, whether it's like an introduction for an online class, or whether it's something like a description for a website, like if you're on a team and you're telling a little bit about yourself, then that's a self-description, right? It's describing who you are. Or maybe it's something like the words that we use to describe ourselves a few weeks earlier in the class, or something like answering a question, tell me about yourself, right? A self-description is one way we manage impressions by saying, here's what I think I am like as a person. And it helps the other person prepare and kind of know what to expect. An account might be a story or concept that you use to describe who you are. So maybe you tell the story about how you dealt with a really challenging situation in the workplace, and you're sharing that to somebody that's interviewing you for a job to show that you're responsible and you're good at managing difficult situations. The idea here being that an account or story is able to help show that person who you are. An apology, right? So one idea that this chapter gets into a little bit is known as expectancy violations theory, or EVT. One idea is that oftentimes we feel like we engage in a relationship where communication between ourselves and another person goes against what we feel like is normal or acceptable or okay. That is, there is a violation of what we expect. So maybe you're just getting to know somebody, maybe it's another student in the class, and they get into this really long story about like their entire life, like the challenges that they've been dealing with at home, a huge like breakup that they had, and a ton of different things going on in their lives. And you think, wow, I just met this person, I don't know them very well, right? You will feel in a violation of your expectations and what you feel like is normal or appropriate for that relationship. It goes outside of what you feel like is appropriate for that time, right? Oversharing is a good example of this. Oftentimes, in those situations, we'll use apologies as a way of redirecting or managing the relationship, getting the relationship back on track, right? And a key aspect here is acknowledging that there was something that went against how the relationship was understood or supposed to be. I know I overshared, I was stressed out and not doing well, and recognizing that might help to make that communication go back to a better place. So we use apologies oftentimes in impression management, right? One idea that's been noted a lot is how often people apologize or use the word sorry when it's not needed, right? That's especially something that socially we've been primed to do. It's something that in particular, right, for women, it's disproportionately impacting socially the experiences that a lot of women have. A lot of women feel at times forced by society to apologize a lot more than men, right? So that's one problem that can happen, right, is that society impacts how we view an apology as appropriate to a situation. Another issue here is the role of entitlements and enhancements. So that can be ways that we bolster or impact our own self-concept to others. So for instance, maybe it's giving a title. So if you know that like it's so-and-so Esquire who is an attorney, right, and using like an honorific or a formal title to describe themselves, we might use that to bolster their credibility. Flattery, right, using compliments, talking positively about the other person in order to get that person to feel better about us is one strategy that's common too. And then favors, doing something and acting in a way that helps another person is another way that we might have a positive impression be created, right? One kind of tip when it comes to apologies in communication studies, right, is that a good apology typically has three parts. It has the actual physical apology, I'm sorry, right? It has an acknowledgement of the issue or thing that you did wrong. and then has an explanation of the thing that you intend to change or correct to prevent that from happening again in the future. So I'm sorry, I overshared a lot of details about my life with somebody that was just getting to know. In the future, I'll try to check in with you before sharing that information. So that can be one way we manage our impressions effectively with other people. So I'm curious, how many folks have ever seen any of the Shrek movies? A lot of you, right? A movie that has bizarrely been memed to death, but kind of an interesting application of social penetration theory. Does anybody remember the onion scene? Yeah. So, right, there's a point in Shrek where, the main character, right, he's this ogre who feels like he's misunderstood because a lot of people are afraid of him, right? He says to Donkey, right, I'm like an onion. I have layers. There's more to me. I'm more complex than you might think. And that's social penetration theory, right? The onion analogy is used all the time to talk about and understand what social penetration theory is and how it works. So social penetration theory gets at the idea that we essentially have these different layers and parts of ourself and identity that we start to unfurl and disclose more and more as we get to know and we feel more trusting around people. This is especially true in the context of friendships, romantic relationships, people we're not necessarily connected with through blood, right? So for instance, we start here with this kind of peripheral layer. And if you think about it, at the beginning of just about every class, you're oftentimes asked to go around and share some peripheral information about yourself. What's your name? Where are you from? What's your major? What year are you in school, right? And oftentimes we feel comfortable about that information because it's pretty low stakes. So at a basic level, sharing information that's pretty widely accessible, just about anybody could know this about you if they looked long enough or just had a brief conversation with you. That's this peripheral layer. It's letting the other person know really basic stuff and helping to establish the relationship with that other person. You share low stakes information with somebody, and you're using that to gauge their response and to understand how much they're willing to share as well, right? If you're getting to know and sharing that basic information and somebody seems a little bit off, then you can feel comfortable knowing that you didn't share a ton of personal details, right? Stranger danger. So this peripheral layer helps us to understand and feel safe around others. The intermediate layer gets at some of the more detailed beliefs and thoughts that we have on certain topics, right? So political and maybe religious views, your activities and things that you enjoy doing, right? Those are things that tend to happen in the middle layer. And the middle layer is oftentimes this make or break moment for a lot of relationships. Maybe you're getting to know a good friend, and you find that you're on totally different planets when it comes to political and social issues. You find it a lot harder to connect or really to move past this intermediate layer, right? That can be one way of thinking about how we engage in relationships. So oftentimes we have our more beliefs that we use and the things that we enjoy in life here. And then the really important stuff to us, like our core, like our self-concept, our dreams, our goals, the things that we're afraid of, the things that really deeply matter for us, are things in that central layer and things that we don't necessarily choose to share with other people unless we've made it there to that point and we really feel comfortable around the other person. So these different layers are a way of thinking about the relationships that we choose to do with other people, right? And how over time the topics and issues and things that we're comfortable discussing can change. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on the Johari window because I think that the discussion group did a great job of talking about using the video to help us understand this idea further. But Donald Rumsfeld, who formerly served in the George W. Bush administration in kind of a senior advisory position, had this quote that sounds really silly and seems like it doesn't make sense, but it's weirdly appropriate, right? He says, "There are known knowns, that which is known. There are known unknowns, that which we know we don't know. And there are unknown unknowns, that which we don't know we don't know," right? And it sounds silly, but it actually kind of describes the Johari window, right? The known knowns, the things that you know about yourself and other people know about you. I'm an athlete, I'm on the volleyball team. Things that are known unknowns, right? Those are things that other people know about you, but you don't know about yourself. So that's why we get so squeamish when we hear a recording of ourselves, because we think, did I really say that? Do I really talk like that? Do I use those verbal fillers all the time? So those are things that other people pick up on that we miss. The hidden self are things that we know but choose not to share or disclose to other people. Again, for folks that might be coming out in terms of gender, gender identity, sexuality, sexual orientation, there might be a reason not to feel comfortable sharing or putting parts out of the hidden self. And then the unknown self, right, our unknown unknowns, things that neither you nor the other person know. So those might be things such as maybe you decide later in life that you're going to do a career change and become a veterinarian, right? You discover that later, but neither you nor the other person are aware of those things right now. So the window is a way that we can think about how we disclose and share who we are with other people. This blind self on the top right is especially important because we don't know the full picture of who we are. There oftentimes are a lot of things that other people pick up on with us that we don't quite realize for ourselves. We might check in with the other person and say, hey, am I sounding okay? We might use something like the looking glass self, or imagining how other people perceive us in order to better understand this quadrant. But it's kind of like a blind spot when you're driving in a car, right? It's this part that you don't quite capture and that you try to compensate for with other means. I think the discussion group did a great job of talking about these different quadrants too, and using some examples. I'm going to actually have us do an activity here in just a little bit that's a way for you to apply and think about those things. Again, think about this both in terms of whether it's cooperative or competitive, and whether it's two-way or one-way, right? Dialogue, right? If you've ever read any of Plato's dialogues with Socrates, right? He's having this conversation. Dialogic communication is something that, dating back to the Greeks, they say is the pursuit of truth or greater knowledge, right? It's engaging with other people in a way to better understand them. When we think about debate, one thing that oftentimes is not realized is in something like a competitive debate or a formal debate, right? It's not necessarily about convincing the other person, it's about convincing the audience. So you focus on using another person's points and saying, hey, look at what they are saying. So if you ever notice in a debate that somebody mentions they say or their argument is X rather than your argument is this or that, that's because a debate generally focuses on the audience rather than the other person. Discourse, right, is one-way cooperative, so something like a lecture, right, I think the group brought up something like a pastor or religious leader giving a sermon. It's an example of that. And then a diatribe could be something like you're sent to the principal's office and they scold you. The parent is like punishing or reprimanding you. It's this not meant to be cooperative, but is meant to advocate for your own view and sort of leave the other person to the curb. So I know we went through kind of a lot of ideas for today. Major ideas that I wanted to cover were about how we use conversations to fulfill some basic needs in life, things that are really important to us. How we use self-disclosure in relationship to our conversations too. We use conversations to learn more about ourselves and those around us. And also the idea that things such as the social penetration theory and Johari window help us make sense of how we choose to disclose and communicate who we are to other people. So we have about 5 minutes or so left in class. And what I'd like us to do with the remaining time is on your own. You can write or type this. I want you to think of an example in your life of each of the 4 styles of conversation. So I'll pull up that slide again in just a minute. So maybe, for instance, dialogue was a recent chat you had with a friend. So think about an example for each of those 4, and then you're welcome to turn that in with your name on it, and once you do so, you're welcome to go for the day. So one example for each of these 4 types. Think about this a little bit on your own. Once you have that, you're welcome to pass it forward to me, and then I will see you again on Wednesday. Thank you. Thank you. Awesome. Okay. Thanks, Dad.
Either I'm gonna be really late or I'm gonna miss it all.
Okay.
Until
No problem.
and then I'll just do the makeup shoot.
Yep. Thanks for checking. Since we are at the end of class, I don't want to hold you up if you've got another place to go after this. So you're welcome to turn in what you have if you're not quite finished. If you do want to keep working and you are not in a rush, you can, but I don't want to keep you longer. Okay, thank you. Awesome. Thank you. Direct for my one. Oh, yeah. Thanks.